Hey there, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's, well, super relevant to anyone who works or hires. How do we know who's going to be great at their job? Is there a way to predict someone's future success?
Hmm.
You've sent over a bunch of academic articles to unpack all from a special issue of the journal Human Performance. It sounds like the core of this debate revolves around something called general mental ability, or G for short.
That's right. This collection dives into the heart of the G debate within industrial work and organizational psychology.
Okay, so before we even get into the debate, let's start with the basics. What exactly is G, and how did this concept come about?
Well, the story of G goes back over a century to a psychologist named Charles Spearman. He was studying cognitive tests and noticed something fascinating. People who performed well on one type of mental test, like solving math problems, tended to do well on other tests too, even though those tests were completely different, like remembering lists of words.
Interesting. So it's like being good at one mental task makes you better at other mental tasks, even if they seem unrelated.
Exactly. Spearman proposed that there's a general factor of intelligence, which he called G, that underlies all these different mental abilities. Think of G like the processing power of your computer. A more powerful computer can handle more complex programs and data, just like a person with higher G might be better at handling complex information and learning new things.
That makes sense. But is G an actual thing in our brains, like a smart center, or is it just a convenient label we use to describe this general mental ability?
That's a great question, and it sparked a lot of debate. Some researchers think G might just be a statistical artifact, a result of how we measure intelligence. But many others, including Linda Gottfredson, whose work you sent over, argue that G reflects a real and fundamental capacity for complex information processing.
Okay, so Gottfredson thinks G is less about being a whiz at specific things and more about how your brain tackles any kind of complex mental task.
Right. That's pretty powerful if it's true. It is. And the editors of this special issue, Ones and Viswesaren, are very much in G's real camp as well. They've gathered decades of research across many cultures, showing that G consistently emerges from different cognitive tests and actually predicts real-world outcomes, not just test scores.
Okay, so this is more than just an academic debate. It sounds like understanding G has practical implications for things like education and hiring. But if G is so important, how do we even measure it? Is there some kind of G meter we can hook people up to?
Not quite. But the most common way to measure G is through cognitive ability tests.
Yeah.
You've probably heard of some of these, like the SAT or ACT, used for college admissions. There are also tests specifically for the workplace, like the ASV used by the U.S. military, which Eleanor Reed discussed in one of the articles you shared.
Okay, so we have tests to measure this G factor, but the real question is, does it actually matter on the job? I mean, does a higher G score really translate to better job performance?
Here's where the research gets really compelling. Schmidt and Hunter, who are major figures in IWO psychology, conducted a massive study, combining results from tons of other studies, called a meta-analysis. And their findings were remarkable. G consistently predicts job performance across a huge range of occupations, from entry-level positions to complex, highly skilled jobs.
Wait, so no matter what the job is, G matters. That's surprising. How strong is the connection between G and job success?
Well, they found that the correlation between G and job performance, after correcting for various factors, is around 0.51. To put that into perspective, that means G is a stronger predictor of job success than things like interviews, reference checks, or even years of experience.
Wow, only 25%. That seems pretty low. What about all the other factors that contribute to someone being good at their job?
You're right to be curious about that. It means there's a lot more to job performance than just G. While G is powerful, it's definitely not the be-all and end-all.
So, if G isn't the whole story, what are some of the other key ingredients that go into job success?
Well, first off, there's something called specific abilities. G gives us this broad measure of general mental ability. But Tenepire's research highlights that specific abilities can be even better predictors of performance in certain roles.
So it's like G might tell you someone is a quick learner overall, but specific abilities tell you how good they are at, say, spatial reasoning, which would be crucial for an architect or a pilot. It seems like different jobs would require different strengths.
Exactly. You also have to consider personality and motivation.
Yeah.
Goldstein, Zidek, and Goldstein really emphasize this point in their work.
Yeah.
They found that traits like conscientiousness, being organized, responsible, hardworking, play a significant role in job success.
That makes sense. Even if you have the brains, you still need the drive and work ethic to really excel.
Right. And there's another fascinating factor
Mm.
that Sternberg and Hedlund bring up: practical intelligence.
Yeah.
This is all about being able to solve real-world problems using something they call tacit knowledge.
Tacit knowledge, that sounds intriguing, but also kind of vague. What is that
I see.
exactly?
It's the kind of knowledge you pick up through experience, not from textbooks. It's like understanding the unspoken rules of the game in a specific field. For example, imagine you're a new salesperson. Tacit knowledge would be things like knowing how to build rapport with a customer, handle objections, and ultimately close a deal. These are things you learn from being in the field and making those mistakes, not just from reading a sales manual.
I'm starting to see how practical intelligence would be especially valuable in jobs where there's a lot of ambiguity, where you have to think on your feet and adapt to changing situations.
Absolutely. And there's another aspect of job performance that Borman and Motowidlow highlight: contextual performance. This is about going above and beyond your assigned tasks, being a good team player, helping colleagues, and contributing to the overall work environment. You could think of these as soft skills.
So even if you're a G superstar,
Yeah.
you still need to be able to play well with others and be a valuable member of the team.
Right. It shows that job success is a complex mix of factors.
This is getting complex. And speaking of complex, I know there's a whole other layer to this G debate, right? The issue of how G is used in hiring and whether that's fair.
You're right. And we'll delve into that further in the next part of our deep dive.
Great. Let's take a moment to recap what we've covered so far. We've learned that G, or general mental ability, emerged from Charles Spearman's work with cognitive tests and represents a general factor of intelligence underlying various mental abilities. We discussed how G can be measured and the surprising finding that it's a powerful predictor of job success across a wide range of occupations. However, we also uncovered that G is not the only ingredient in the recipe for job success.
Yes. Factors like specific abilities, personality traits, practical intelligence, and contextual performance also play crucial roles.
Right. And we've only just started scratching the surface of this fascinating topic. There's so much more to explore. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll tackle the complexities and controversies surrounding the use of G in selection and hiring. See you in a bit.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were uncovering the power of G, this general factor of intelligence, and how it impacts job performance. But we also started touching on some of the more complex and controversial aspects of using G in hiring decisions.
You're right. This is where the discussion gets really interesting and potentially a bit tricky to navigate.
Okay, so let's dive right in. We talked about how G is a powerful predictor of job performance, but I know some people argue it's not fair to rely too heavily on it when making hiring decisions. What are their concerns?
One of the biggest concerns is that focusing primarily on G could lead to a lack of diversity in the workplace. Remember, we discussed how G is often measured using cognitive ability tests. And there's been research showing that certain groups tend to score differently on these tests, on average. So even if the tests themselves aren't biased, the way they're used could still create barriers for certain groups. That definitely raises some red flags.
Exactly. And some argue that this lack of diversity isn't just unfair. It's also not good for organizations in the long run. Having a more diverse workforce brings in a wider range of perspectives,
just sharing
ideas, which research suggests can lead to greater innovation and problem solving.
That makes sense. But on the flip side, I imagine some organizations might push back and say they have a responsibility to hire the most qualified candidates to ensure their business is successful, and G helps them do that.
Absolutely. And that's where things get complicated. It's this tension between efficiency and equity that Murphy, one of the researchers you share, discusses in his work. Organizations want to be both fair and successful.
So it's a tough balancing act. How are companies trying to handle this dilemma? What are some alternatives to just relying on G for hiring decisions?
Well, one approach is to broaden the definition of qualified beyond just cognitive ability. Remember all those other important factors we talked about. Things like specific abilities, personality traits, the practical intelligence, or tacit knowledge, and even work ethic and motivation. Many organizations are starting to incorporate these factors into their hiring processes.
So instead of relying on a single test score, companies are trying to get a more holistic picture of the candidate.
Right. They're using a wider range of tools like personality assessments, structured interviews where everyone gets asked the same questions, work samples that let candidates show their skills, and even simulations to see how they'd handle
Hmm.
real-world scenarios.
That's interesting. It seems like a more well-rounded approach. But wouldn't some people argue that those methods aren't as good as using GS for predicting how someone will perform on the job?
There are definitely researchers, like Schmidt, who, while acknowledging the importance of those other factors,
Yeah.
still believe G is the single best predictor
Mhm.
of job performance. They're concerned that moving away from using G in selection could lead to a decline in overall workforce competence.
So they're worried that if companies focus too much on diversity, they might end up with employees who aren't as skilled or capable.
That's their concern. And to be fair, some of their worries are based on real-world examples. Schmidt points to cases where organizations reduced their emphasis on cognitive ability tests in hiring. And it did lead to some negative consequences, like a drop in performance standards or an increase in accidents in the workplace.
Okay, that's definitely something to consider. It sounds like there are real stakes involved in this debate, not just theoretical arguments. So where does this leave us? What's takeaway for someone listening who's trying to make sense of all this?
I think one of the most important takeaways is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. The world of work is complex, as are people, and finding the right balance for any organization is going to depend on a lot of factors.
So it's less about G versus everything else and more about finding the right approach for each specific situation.
Exactly. And it's about being really clear on what your goals and values are as an organization. What are you trying to achieve with your hiring process? Is it solely about finding people who will have the highest job performance based on their G? Or are you also prioritizing diversity and inclusion, even if that means potentially losing some predictive power?
That's a really important point. Those two goals might not always be perfectly aligned.
Right. It's a tough decision for organizations to make. And it requires careful consideration of the research, the ethical implications, and the potential consequences, both positive and negative, of different approaches.
This has been really eye-opening. I can definitely see why this is such a debated topic. So we've talked about G, how it's measured, its predictive power, the other factors that matter for job success, and the ethical considerations. But I'm curious, what does this mean for me as an individual? What can I actually take away from all this research and apply to my own career?
That's a great question. I think one key takeaway, regardless of where you stand on the whole GE debate, is that your cognitive ability is a valuable asset. It can help you succeed in lots of different areas, like learning new skills, solving challenging problems, and adapting to change.
So even if you're not the person with the highest G score in the room, you can still leverage your mental strengths to reach your goals.
Absolutely. And research suggests that you can actually enhance your cognitive abilities through things like education, training, and challenging yourself mentally.
I love that. So it's not like you're stuck with a fixed amount of G for your whole life. You can actually improve it.
That's exactly. Gottfredson, who we mentioned earlier, describes G as a capacity for learning and adapting to complexity. And that suggests it's something that can be developed and strengthened over time.
Okay, so focusing on developing our cognitive abilities is a good thing, but we've also talked about all those other factors that are important for job success, like specific skills, personality traits, practical intelligence. Do you have any advice for our listeners who want to develop those other skills and qualities?
When it comes to specific skills, the key is to identify your strengths and weaknesses, and then focus on developing the skills that are most relevant to your field. Think about where you excel and where you could use some improvement.
There are tons of resources available, from online courses to workshops to books, that can help you sharpen those skills.
That's all about being proactive
and
taking charge of your own development. What about personality traits? Can those be changed or improved? That's a more complicated question. Some personality traits are more flexible than others. But even if you can't drastically change your core personality, you can definitely develop strategies to manage your tendencies and adapt to different situations.
For example, if someone isn't naturally super organized, they could learn time management techniques and ways to stay on top of their tasks.
Yeah, exactly. And when it comes to practical intelligence, or that tacit knowledge we talked about earlier, the best way to develop it is to become a lifelong learner. Be curious, pay attention, try new things, and observe how things really work in your field. Learn from your mistakes and successes, and don't be afraid to ask questions and seek guidance from more experienced colleagues or mentors. Tacit knowledge often comes from experience and observation. So find those wise owls in your field and learn from their insights.
I love that. Find the wise owls. So we've covered cognitive ability, specific skills,
Hmm.
personality,
Hmm.
practical intelligence. Is there anything else our listeners should be considering as they navigate their careers?
There's one more thing that's absolutely crucial
Hmm.
for long-term success, and it's often overlooked. Motivation. Why are you doing what you're doing? What are your goals and aspirations? What gets you excited to get out of bed in the morning and tackle your work?
Right. Passion and a sense of purpose, those are powerful drivers.
They are, and research shows that people who are intrinsically motivated, meaning they find their work personally meaningful and engaging, tend to be more successful and fulfilled in their careers.
So it's not just about being smart or skilled. It's also about finding your why, your reason for doing the work.
Exactly. And what motivates you might evolve over time, which is perfectly normal. The important thing is to stay connected to what drives you and try to align your work with your values and goals.
That's a really powerful message. It's about taking ownership, not just of your skills and knowledge, but also of your motivation and sense of purpose.
Absolutely. And it underscores the idea that work can be about more than just earning a paycheck. It can be about finding meaning, pursuing your passions, and making a contribution that you find fulfilling.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with the science of G and job performance, explored the complexities of the debate surrounding its use in hiring, and now we've landed on some practical advice for individuals navigating their own careers.
We've covered a lot of ground for sure.
But it feels like we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to learn and explore about this fascinating field of IWO psychology.
There always is.
Before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. We've been talking about She and its predictive power for job success, but what if we flipped the script? What if we started thinking about She not just as something we measure to predict success, but as a valuable resource that can be nurtured and developed to create a more adaptable, resilient, and innovative workforce? How might that change how we approach education, training, and even talent development?
That's a really intriguing question. It challenges us to think beyond just selecting individuals based on their G and consider how we might actively cultivate G in everyone to create a more capable workforce overall.
Exactly. It's almost like viewing G not as a fixed trait, but as something that can be grown and developed.
Right. Shifting our focus from measurement to development.
I love that idea. Well, on that thought-provoking note, we'll wrap up this part of our deep dive. We'll pick up this conversation in the next and final part, where we'll explore what this shift in perspective could mean for the future of work. See you soon.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on quite a journey exploring this concept of G and its influence on the world of work.
It's been a fascinating discussion, hasn't it? It really has. We've covered so much ground. From the historical roots of G to the complexities of measuring it, the debates about its role in hiring decisions, and even touched upon the ethical considerations surrounding its use. But before we wrap up our deep dive, I'd like to circle back to that thought-provoking question we posed at the end of the last part. We spent a lot of time talking about G as a predictor of job success. But what if we shifted our perspective and started thinking about it as a valuable resource that can be nurtured and developed? Imagine if we focused on cultivating G in everyone, not just using it, to select a chosen few.
That's a really powerful idea, and one that aligns with Gottfried's view of G as a capacity for learning, adapting to complexity, and solving problems. If we embrace that perspective, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities for individuals, organizations, and society as a whole.
It does. Instead of seeing G as some fixed trait you're either born with or not, we could start viewing it as a skill that can be strengthened and developed over time.
Exactly. It's like shifting our focus from measurement to development. Instead of just asking, how much G do you have? We can start asking, how can we help you develop your G to its full potential?
I love that shift in thinking. So paint me a picture. What could this G-focused future of work actually look like in practice?
Well, for starters, we might see a change in educational practices. Instead of emphasizing rote memorization and standardized tests that often focus on narrow skills, imagine if schools prioritized learning experiences that truly challenge students to think critically, analyze information, and apply their knowledge to real-world situations.
So less about cramming facts and more about building those core cognitive skills that underpin G. That sounds a lot more engaging and effective, honestly.
And in the workplace, organizations could invest more heavily in cognitive training programs, specifically designed to enhance G. We can see innovative programs using techniques like gamification, simulations, and personalized learning paths to make the training more engaging and relevant to different roles and industries.
It would be like a gym for your brain. Instead of lifting weights, you're working at your cognitive muscles.
I love that analogy, a G gym. And the exciting thing is that research suggests these types of interventions can have a real impact on improving cognitive abilities. It's not just wishful thinking. There's science to back it up.
That's so encouraging. It makes you wonder, what kind of impact could this focus on developing G have on a larger scale?
Well, think about it. We might see a more adaptable and resilient workforce, better equipped to handle the rapid pace of change, technological advancements, and complex challenges that are becoming increasingly common in today's world.
It's like giving everyone a cognitive upgrade, not just in terms of specific skills, but in their ability to learn, adapt, and solve problems.
Exactly. And from an individual perspective, this shift in thinking could be incredibly empowering. Imagine knowing that you're not limited
By some predetermined level of G, that you have the power to enhance your cognitive abilities throughout your life.
That could open up so many opportunities for growth and development, both personally and professionally.
Wow, that's a really powerful message. It's about taking control of your own cognitive destiny.
Precisely. And it highlights the importance of viewing G, not just as some abstract concept that only matters for academics or for getting a certain job, but as a fundamental human capability that has the potential to impact every aspect of our lives.
This has been such an amazing deep dive. We've gone from the historical origins of G to the cutting-edge research on its role in the workplace and beyond. We've wrestled with tough questions about fairness and the best ways to measure human potential. And we've even dared to envision a future where G is seen not just as a predictor of success, but as a catalyst for creating a more adaptable, resilient, and innovative world.
It's been quite a journey, and one that underscores the incredible capacity of the human mind to learn, grow, and evolve.
It really has. So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop challenging yourself mentally. Remember, your brain is an incredible instrument, and with the right care and attention, you can unlock its full potential.
Absolutely. Never underestimate the power of your own mind.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.